Here's a hot take you haven't heard from me before. I don't like the way 5e does something. Big shocker. Gonna get all the views. All right. So specifically, as the title of this video suggests, I don't like legendary resistances or legendary actions as a solution for the problem of the one monster versus an entire party problem. Now, this is an inherent problem for any RPG that uses like an action economy, such as D&D and all of its offshoots. This would be the same problem in something like Fabula Ultima, same problem in something like Legend of the Five Rings. Anything that uses like turns and actions in a round, usually in an initiative order, you're all going to have this problem where usually the side with the most actions just kind of wins by default. And so you have to incorporate into these games specific mechanics in order to combat this problem, because the single boss monster, boss enemy trope is a very powerful one. It's a very evocative one, and it's one that you want to be able to support. But you have to incorporate rules to allow that, to make that an actually engaging encounter for the players without it being just like ramp up the numbers on it so high that like they get trounced, but also like to keep it viable so it doesn't just, you know, do a couple of attacks and then die immediately. So this is a problem inherent to the style of gameplay that D&D is. This is not something that 5e introduced. It's not something that 3e introduced. It's not something that is it's not like the Marshall Caster gap is a problem that D&D does on purpose. It doesn't have to be there. It's not there by default. The way that they go about designing classes has created this problem. But this problem is not that. This problem is sort of inherent in the whole idea of actions. And you can tell because it is reflected in real life. You know, if you have 5 people in a fight against one person, you should expect the 5 people to win unless there is some sort of extreme gap in preparedness or armament or training. You know, the numbers generally wins. Bigger army diplomacy and whatnot. So the way that different games go about it can tell you a lot about the way that those games are meant to be played and the way that the designers of those games regard the problem to begin with and how they decide to approach it. A quick example off the top of my head, 4th edition has solo monsters. Solo monsters have about 4 times as much health as a normal monster because they are replacing 4 monsters in the XP budget for the encounter. And they tend to have multi-attack abilities. They have 2 action points, so they can sort of surge a couple of times. They get bonuses to saves so that effects that would last a long time don't last as long on them. And then I think their defenses tend to be very slightly higher than normal. Not by a lot, because you don't go too much higher than baseline before it becomes a problem. And then you have, like, 3rd edition D&D didn't really address this problem at all. Like, they just didn't, they did not address it. There were no mechanics to address this. So single monster encounters just tended to be either really easy. They tended to be really easy for one side or the other, depending on how much higher level the creature is than the party. 5th edition does this in a particular way. Monsters that are meant to be encountered by themselves tend to have 2 things: legendary resistances and legendary actions. I'm going to address the former first. Legendary resistances are not a terrible mechanic. They're not ideal. For sure, like, using a resource that calls for a save, a spell, generally, and then having them fail that save and then just choose to succeed instead feels kind of bad. Like we all understand why that mechanic is there, because spells that shut down enemies are just too powerful. They're just too powerful to allow that to go off on a single enemy. The mighty ancient dragon that's supposed to threaten the entire party gets hit with, a whole monster, and now it's just done. The party's going to get a whole round of attacks with advantage. They're just going to, drop it, and it's going to get no actions. And, potentially it might fail its next save as well. And hold monster's not even a great example. There's plenty of spells that are going to shut it down harder and don't allow extra saves. So, legendary resistances are sort of necessary. They're a necessary byproduct of the fact that spells are just too good. So I would regard legendary resistances as a necessary evil because of the way that the game is set up. I would prefer, rather, that spells not be so powerful so that legendary resistances don't need to exist. Imagine if it had, in addition to legendary resistances, or as a parallel to it, 3 times per day, it can just choose to not be hit by an attack that hit it. That's not as powerful. It's strong, to be sure, that's a strong ability, but it's definitely not as powerful as choosing to succeed on a save, because attacks just don't do that much. They do a little bit of damage, and that's it. They usually don't do a lot of damage all at once. Usually. So, legendary resistances I don't like as a concept because it feels bad for the player. It almost feels a little bit like you're being robbed a bit, but I understand why they need to exist, and I appreciate that. The other half of this is legendary actions. Now, here's why I don't like legendary actions, and I don't think that they should exist. Legendary actions are there to correct for the action economy. A single monster against, say, 4 or 5 player characters is going to be having a commensurately smaller amount of threat that it's able to put out. If the monster is getting, 3 or 4 attacks, doing the equivalent of 1 monster's worth of damage on its turn, and then you have, 4 or 5 player characters that are all just sort of pounding on it with their full action economy, that's really one-sided. And if you don't want to just bump its health to the sky, multiplying it by several times, you have to give it more actions for it to be a threat to the party, because if it's, you don't want the fight to go on for so long that with a single turn every round, it's able to actually threaten to bring the party down, because the party's got a lot of resources. By the time you start facing monsters with these legendary abilities, excuse me, man, it's almost cleared up, this thing I got going on. Almost gone. By the time you start facing enemies with these legendary abilities, you're reasonably high level. I think those first ones start hitting around level 5, 6, something like that. And at that point, you have enough sustainability and enough durability and enough ability to control the battlefield as a party that 1 action a turn is just not going to threaten you for a dozen turns if you're pouring all your resources into this. So you want the monster to be able to have the offensive effectiveness of more than 1 monster if it's going to be serving as a solo creature. And you can do this one of 2 different ways in general. Well, sorry, one of 3 different ways. 1, you can just give it more turns. You can say, all right, this creature acts on initiative 20, 15, 10, and 5. And, that's when the creature acts, and it takes full turns. What this partly means is because 5e uses a until end of turn duration mechanic for most of its effects, then those effects are going to be wearing off faster. They're not going to last a full round if it's acting 4 times around, because it's going to have 4 turns, and also it just has more effectiveness. This is very similar. This is very similar to legendary actions, in that a creature may perform more than 1 thing before you get a turn. As a result, I tend to disfavor this mechanic. And I'll tell you why that is. A lot of the like tactical considerations of 5th edition has to do with like laying down zones of effect, or positioning yourself such that you are, you know, adjacent to the enemy or not adjacent to the enemy. You know, these sorts of things, like that's pretty much all of the tactical considerations in the game, is like, where do I put my zone and where do I stand? And if the monster is able to move on its turn, and then again, the monster takes its turn, and then you position yourself accordingly, and then the monster gets to move again, and nearly, I think, everything with legendary actions gets to do a move as one of them. Like, it's moving on somebody else's turn, or between turns, I guess, technically. Which means that if you put down an area of effect, it can just move out and not be affected by it, which means you missed with an AoE. And that's really weird. It makes them faster than normal. And here's the thing. If you are giving a monster 4 actions in a round, you got to make sure to bump its speed down to 1/4 of what it should be. You know, give it more actions. Don't make it super duper fast. And so giving it extra turns is slightly better, I think, than legendary actions, on the basis that it still starts its turn and it still ends its turn, which is what you expect when a creature is doing things. You know, if I put down, you know, Everid's Black Tentacles and it starts its turn there, it's got to make a save, which means that my spell has had its effect. If I put down Everid's Black Tentacles and it uses a legendary action to just move out of the way, well, I get no value. And so I have spent resources with the expectation of gaining value, or at least a chance of gaining value. And it negates that without even a die roll. And without expending anything, because legendary actions are functionally free. You just use them pretty much as fast as you can. So extra turns, slightly better than legendary actions. Number 2, you could use legendary actions. I put that on the list. Legendary actions. Actions that are off turn, between enemy turns. It's as awkward. It is not well integrated into the mechanics of 5th edition. It does feel like looking at the rules and seeing it in play, it feels very much like legendary actions were tacked on very close to the end of development. They weren't there all the time because they don't really interact with any other part of the system. They don't feel, they're not intuitive, and they don't, there's no other mechanics that sort of point to legendary actions and say, hey, you can do something about this. It just doesn't happen. And so I think that is probably the worst option of these 3. The third option, of course, is to modify the monster's stats and its abilities such that it is able to threaten more than one enemy at a time. And here's why I think this is a better solution than giving it more turns. A, it functions within the basic framework of the game. The game is sort of assumed that you are going to be taking one turn around and you are going to be doing X number of actions on your turn. And this falls within that framework and it follows it. And so the rest of the game will function normally around that. Number 2, it prevents the monster from being able to just sort of like super focus one enemy or one player character. Yeah. Now, this could still happen if you design it wrong, but the way that I have in mind is multi-target threats. Yeah, pretty much gone. Multi-target threats, i.e. beholder rays shooting at multiple targets. You know, it gets X number of random rays, and it has to target different creatures. Dragon's Breath covers an area. It's not going to hit an enemy more than once, but it will hit several enemies at once. These kinds of multi-target threat abilities make it so that more player characters are involved in the combat. It's very easy a lot of the times, especially with single target, single action enemies, to, as a player character, just sort of stand back and do your thing. Especially if you're a ranged combatant, you can sort of stand back, shoot, 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 shoot. Maybe they get a little close and you back up, shoot, shoot, shoot. Or if you're a wizard, you know, put down AoE and then cantrip, 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 cantrip. And you don't really, like, there's no back and forth. You know, you're not taking damage. You're not being threatened. You're, you know, your positioning is kind of safe and static. Which is not ideal, I think. Combat is most interesting when the most players are involved in, like, exchanging damage. You know, you're being threatened and you're covering threats and you're trying to reposition for, you know, greater advantage. And these area of effect or multi-target attack abilities accomplish that. And so that's why I think that is an ideal solution. But what that means is that every monster that is meant to be fought by itself needs to have these kinds of attacks and features built in. And 5e just doesn't do that. Most monster stat blocks literally are just like your standard stats that everyone gets, you know, your hit points, your AC, your ability scores. And then it goes into like, oh, here's your regular attack. Maybe you get a multi-attack as well, and you're going to do 2 or 3 regular attacks as an action. And then, like, 1 reaction, usually. You know, even dragons, these, like, archetypal single enemy boss monsters, usually have, like, what, 3 different actions that they can do? And, like, one of them is a basic attack that you're never going to do as an action, except maybe as, a, like, you know, an opportunity attack. And one of them is a multi-attack. And then, like, it's got a breath weapon. Oh, and then Frightful Presence. So you get, like, 4 actions that it can do. And, like, the Frightful Presence and the breath weapon hit multiple targets. The multi-attack can all be on 1 target. But none of these really make up for the fact that the entire party is allied against you. And you, like, these don't overcome the action economy. And it's frustrating to me that Wizards of the Coast tends to, when they are making 5th edition monsters, they tend to default to this sort of lazy stat block creation where, you know, you get your basic attack, maybe you get a multi-attack, and you get like 1 more thing. These basic stat blocks are never going to suffice as a solo monster unless you give them cheaty effects like legendary actions and legendary saves. And it's just not an ideal way to go about it, in my opinion. The legendary save and legendary action mechanics are poorly integrated into the game itself. And I think there is just a better way to do it. And they used to do it that way. And that's the really frustrating thing. They used to do it that way, and now they don't. And I think that's kind of sad.